Rasmus.
Oh, you must. You tweeted. I
Yeah.
think you were on
Hey.
Twitter.
Nice to see you.
The writer.
Good afternoon.
That's good.
No. Let's just wait for quiet. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming out in the rain. I need to start with a few disclosures here. The first is that I'm not Campbell Brown, and neither is anyone here. Campbell decided not to come. I don't even know what the reason is. We can probably guess a few of them. But we decided with Ariana and Chris to go ahead and do a session on Facebook, and that it could be valuable to do that. And my thought was to model this after a session that I always ask for at Google Newsgeist, which is what could Google do for news? And at last year's Newsgeist at Arizona State University, there was a second session, what could Facebook do for news? So we thought today we would do a session on what should Facebook and company do for news, and to make that a conversation of the whole room. We could spend the day bashing Facebook, but the American Congress just spent 2 days doing that, so I think it's a bit redundant. Instead, what I hope is that we bring this down to journalism, and that we ask what journalism and the platforms, particularly Facebook, could do together for the benefit of society, for the benefit of news, for the benefit of the public. So that's our idea today. One more disclosure on my own behalf. I started the News Integrity Initiative at CUNY, run by my colleagues Molly Diaguiar and Jenny Choi. For that, we raised funds from Facebook, Craig Newmark Philanthropies, the Ford Foundation, AppNexus, and others. I am independent. We are independent of Facebook. I receive no money personally from any platform. So I just want to make that clear, and I hope I will demonstrate my independence as the afternoon goes on. So, the other thing I want to say, Dave Weiner unfortunately is not here, but Dave was here last year. I learned a lesson at the very first BloggerCon. We had a festival like this for bloggers back in the wonderful early days of the internet when we all liked each other and we all had blog roles and we all got along somehow. And there was a session about politics, and I said to Dave something about my panel. And Dave quite properly scolded me and said, first, it's not your panel, Jarvis. Second, you know what? There is no panel. The room is the panel. So we have very smart people up here, but you are all on the panel, and as we go along, I want to bring you into the conversation, and I hope that we come up with constructive things that we can take back to Facebook and the platforms and try to imagine a more productive relationship among us. All right? So I'm going to let my panelists introduce themselves so I don't get their current titles wrong. And Craig, why don't we start with you and go down and just introduce yourselves first, and then we'll start discussing.
All right. Hi, I'm Craig Silverman. I'm the media editor for BuzzFeed News, and I lead a small team that specializes in covering platforms, but also specifically on digital deception, manipulation, misinformation, and those kinds of things.
My name is Jenny Lee. I am a former New York Times reporter, and I'm a board member of Hacks Hackers, which is a global grassroots group that mixes journalism and technology. And we started MisinfoCon and also the Credibility Coalition, which is an effort to sort of create technical standards for how you assess credibility on the web.
I'm Rasmus Nielsen. I am Director of Research at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford. Again, in the interest of transparency, we receive funding from a wide variety of different companies, foundations, media regulators, universities, and the like, but also from both Google, and we have a new grant incoming from Facebook.
Hello, I'm Tanit Koch. I'm even more independent than Jeff is at the moment because I just quit my job as editor-in-chief of Bild, a very large German newspaper, and currently enjoying my newfound liberty.
Hi, I'm Jay Rosen. I teach journalism at New York University. I am also the director of the Membership Puzzle Project at NYU, which is studying membership models in news. And I write the blog pressthink.org, and I don't get any money from Facebook.
Would you take any?
No.
Okay. Rasmus, I'd like to start with you because I think that we as an industry, we as a society are making a lot of assumptions today about how bad is it and what is the problem we're solving. And you, in your writing and on Twitter, are always admirably fact-based and bringing us back to a reality. So before we get into what problems we're trying to solve, what is the problem and how bad is it?
I think there is no question that platform companies like Facebook have enabled the distribution of disinformation of various sorts. And it's also clear that the same tools that are integral to how progressive activists like Black Lives Matter or Me Too or the Never Again are also used by very regressive political forces around the world, including authoritarian politicians, but also various grassroots movements, in particular on the far right. Beyond that, I think we need to remember, I would say, sort of two things in this discussion around disinformation. One is that, contrary to fears of filter bubbles and echo chambers and the like, most research that I know of suggests that, in fact, using social media and search meaningfully increases the diversity of news that people are exposed to, in particular people with limited interest in news and young people. So it's one of the few forces that counter some of the tendencies towards information inequality we see in our societies. And on the other hand, that while it is clear that these companies thus are challenging the business model behind professional journalism as we knew it, they are at the same time also amongst the most important forms of distribution for that journalism, in particular for a young generation that will, let's face it, very rarely go directly to a print newspaper, broadcaster, or even the website of a legacy news organization.
Jay, when you and I last talked about this, you said that in our expectations of the platforms, we haven't really had that discussion or don't have the terms of that discussion. There's a lot of assumptions going around where they should do that, they should do this. The title of this reformed panel is what Facebook should do. But on what basis? How do we make that decision? What is the state of the discussion publicly about our relationship as journalism, our relationship as society with the platforms?
Well, something very important in that relationship happened this week when Mark Zuckerberg was testifying to Congress. He said something important. He said that we are responsible for the content on Facebook. And that kind of declaration was something the company had in many ways been reluctant to do. He said it very clearly. What he didn't say is that we have an editorial responsibility for what appears on Facebook. That's like the next step that I think we need them to take, because so far what Facebook has done is taken distribution away, seized control of the relationship between the users of news and the content of news, and of course absorbed a lot of the advertising revenue. Now I agree with you that there is no God-given right to ad money, and it doesn't make any sense for news organizations to say, you stole all our ads. Facebook just created a better product. But I think the maturity of the company will lie in not just taking responsibility for the content, as Zuckerberg said, but finally realizing that it has a kind of editorial responsibility. And in that respect, it has to begin behaving like an editorial company. And I don't think they're at that point yet.
Two questions about that. Does Facebook have a public responsibility to inform society? Or what role does it have in informing society? And when I say Facebook, let's include Twitter and Google in that.
Well, Facebook says it has a role because it wants to not only connect people to one another, but connect them to the world. And it also wants a role in the conversations people have with each other, and very often those conversations are around news. So it already says it has a responsibility to news. It just hasn't organized itself around that yet. It doesn't have an editorial culture, for example. Let me back up a second. When Twitter introduced this product that is now called Moments, I believe that it crossed a threshold from being a technology company to being an editorial company with that product. Because now it was curating what was on the platform. It was making choices about what was newsworthy. It was putting together tweets to represent a kind of a story. It was hiring journalists. So I had a chance to interview the head of news for Twitter at that time, and I said, you're creating an editorial product, you become an editorial company, so where are you going to get your editorial culture from? He didn't understand the question.
I'm going to hold my second question in a minute when I go around, because I want to ask all of you the same question. Craig, you, like Rasmus, cover this, research this. What's the this? What's the problem? How big is the problem? What are we trying to address here in making our requests and demands on the platforms as journalists?
I mean, I think there's sort of two big buckets. One is, which is arguably the smaller bucket of the two, which is specific to news and journalism. And then there's a larger bucket of the impact of these platforms on society, information consumption, and all of those things as a whole. And so but I do think they're connected. And so one of the problems, obviously, is they run distribution, they own distribution. And as a result of that, what are their values and how are they enacting that? And I think on the most basic level, one of the fundamental problems we have is they state policies and they state values as companies and organizations, but they don't actually enforce them and make them real on their platforms. And if they actually did the things they say that they want to do, and if their platforms behave the way that they want them to behave, you know, Facebook talks about how informed an audience is. They talk about giving people quality stuff that they can engage in and that makes their lives better. If they actually delivered on that, then I think we'd have fewer problems. And it's not an easy problem to solve, but one of the other problems that we have, which I also think is where journalism comes in, is the scale that they are at is absolutely unheard of in the history of human society. And the different things that take place on these platforms all in one place at that mass scale is unheard of. So the ability for them to enforce their policies and do what they say they want to do, I think no one has ever had to be in that position before, so they don't know how to do it. And so we're seeing a couple things happen now. One is they've realized they need to hire a lot more humans. There are literally tens of thousands of jobs that these companies say they're now hiring, and there's probably a lot more that they're going to need to hire. And those jobs have a potential, psychological toll on people looking at the content. So there's that piece for a societal issue. But that part of it, of actually figuring out how you run these platforms, has not been done yet. And if they ran them the way that they say they want to run them, then I think the problems that you have with news and journalism of succeeding compared to the fake stuff and the misleading stuff and the manipulation starts to actually get addressed through them doing that. So that's, for me, that's the larger piece here, is how do you manage these unheard of massive platforms? And if they do that in accordance with their values, then I think, frankly, a lot of things get better.
Yes, I said earlier today that the scale that enables anyone to speak to everyone around the world and opens up these possibilities also makes it impossible to police it in a way that we in an editorial environment and a gatekeeper environment are used to. And thus the constant call by Mark Zuckerberg for AI, for automated tools and learning sets to make this possible. Jenny, you have been in this as a problem solver. You've been trying to bring together people to find solutions. Where do you think solutions lie? And, well, let me go there.
So I'm going to pull back sort of to a cultural level. And I think I've lived the last 5 years in San Francisco. And one thing to sort of understand about the culture of Silicon Valley is that it really only knows how to value something if it can be measured in numbers with lots of zeros. Like that is what they care about. Is it like, daily active users, monthly active users, how much money did you raise in terms of millions, what was the exit you had in terms of billions, like how much is that person worth? And it's really interesting, and I think that part of it is, they are engineers, numbers are something that they are comfortable with, and so unless you can measure it, they struggle to know how to care about it. I mean, and I mean that on like all kinds of levels, like do you like this movie? Like, I don't know if or it is sort of a cultural tension. And so I remember having one conversation with an engineer in one of these little salon type roundtables after the whole misinformation kind of explosion happened, and he's like, if you could tell us how to measure democracy, then we can move the metric, right? And it was basically that idea, like they know how to move the needle, but you need to come up with a quantitative formula, and without that it was a real struggle. And so it's on some level it is about having a liberal arts education and like what is the good life and what should we care about as society? And I think just sort of on a cultural level, because of the dominance of engineers and even the product people coming from computer science backgrounds, there's sort of a dearth or an absence of like, what should we do, right? And that's sort of a tension between this idea of what I call sort of a bottom-up product mindset, which is like you watch your users, what are they telling you to do? We're going to design, they like sharing, so we're going to change our product and iterate in reaction to what users are doing, versus what I would consider an editorial mindset, which is like, we have a worldview, whether or not it's Vogue or Gawker or The Economist, and like, join us on this worldview or we don't care, right? So you have this fundamental tension between a bottom up and a top down, or basically a descriptive mindset versus a prescriptive mindset. And so on a very sort of visceral level, one of the things is to understand that mindset, right? For them to understand our mindset, for us to understand their mindset, and to try to bring that together. I think that companies like Facebook and in Silicon Valley really sort of embody the DNA of their founders. And so at Google, it's much more of engineering, slightly academic kind of take. In Facebook, it's sort of that move fast and break things mindset that sort of became epically large. So now they care about infrastructure, like move fast or in something like within infrastructure.
My suggestion for changing that is move fast, but think first.
Yes, and so on some level, what we've done is, I can tell you the small piece that I'm working on, which is, first we throw MisinfoCon, which is just like bringing everyone together in the same room. And the key thing there is to have different perspectives working together, because if you have the same people talking about the problem, you have the same toolkit, and so you don't move forward. So like, for an example, what happened at MisinfoCon was someone told me they were doing this machine learning challenge on how to do with misinformation. He's like, oh, there's no good data set. I think the only data set that exists is like some 3-year-old, now 4-year-old article list of like headlines and whatever, and they're mismatched, and that's what everyone's using. And and he's like, and therefore nothing can learn. And it never occurred to this engineer that like, if you need a better data set to train the algorithms, like, we can build that. Like, I can raise a couple $1 million to get that done, but I didn't know that was a problem. And to him, a data set either exists or doesn't exist, right? And so what you need is the journalists and the academics and the engineers to figure out, like, well, and the policy makers to get into the same conversations and figure out what is a problem. It's a block for you, but this is something that we know how to fix. So on some very small level.
Eloquently said. Tanit, you and I met as you were a leader in online journalism, and then you took charge of editorial at Europe's largest newspaper, at Bild. There's been a contentious relationship at that company with various of the platforms. Now, from your independent outlook now, is there a problem? What's the problem? How big is it? And then we're going to come to solutions.
Well, I always feel extremely uncomfortable when a company that isn't able to take down a very, very concrete death threat against a journalist within 24 hours is thinking about editorializing and choosing what is good journalism. So any calls for Facebook to, by self-regulation, change the news feed or promote certain news and downgrade other news, I find highly problematic. It's not there yet, but there are calls for that, and I think that would be the moment when it becomes a massive problem. The other thing is, we've both met in Davos, is that I find particularly Facebook rather patronizing when they talk about they want their users to have time well spent. Well, who's Facebook to decide what time is actually well spent? If I read an article or watch a video about a chlorine gas attack in Syria, that's certainly not going to make my day, but I think it is time well spent. I have a feeling that it's not time well spent in the sense of what Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg see. And adding to what Jenny just said, I think Facebook has a massive problem in actually understanding that news and that journalism isn't just a commodity, that it's not just a tradable good, but that there is a value for society behind it. And because it's a tech company, I think there is a lot of internal cultural change to be done to actually realize that. But I'm worried that because Facebook has so many fields of, they haven't solved yet, that calls for regulation will become much, much stronger, and that you see quite often things well meant, and there is a lot of well-meaning around, but quite often things well meant turn out to be things not very well done. And I fear that the more calls for regulation we'll hear, the less good will actually come out of it.
All right, I want to get to solutions of some depth, but I want to do a shallow question first, because I hear a disagreement already. Two-part lightning round question. Do you expect Facebook and the platform, let me just back up for 1 second. I think we see the potential for a flight to quality occurring here, where we have Google has said, Ben Gomes, the head of search engineering, said in April that Google would henceforth account for the reliability, authority, and quality of sources in search ranking. It's a big deal. Twitter has now released an RFP, a request for proposal, around its impact on the health of the public conversation. Facebook is now, having thrown out public content, in one sense, is trying to bring back quality news and define what quality is. And so we have all three companies trying to worry about this notion of quality. So my lightning round question is, number one, should the platforms be making quality judgments, broadly? And number two, should they be hiring journalists? Then we'll come to deeper questions.
If they are not willing to describe themselves as editorial companies, become editorial companies, and create editorial cultures, if they aren't willing to do that, able to do that, then they should go the opposite way and not try and make any editorial judgments at all, but fund those who do.
I think if Facebook became an editor or a publisher, you'd immediately have massive competitive law problems. It would be the biggest publisher in the whole wide world. And I think that would be a massive threat. So Facebook should definitely not get involved into what is quality, what isn't quality, what people should see, what they shouldn't see. They should sort of not take news out of the news feed. But I do see that sort of blatantly fake news, sort of dead celebrities, etc., where people try to game the business model Facebook is offering. Yes, that's not a question of quality journalism or not, but no, that they should not get editorially involved.
Rasmus.
I think it's clear we all in this room understand that they are already making quality decisions every day, automated at scale, globally, several times a day for several billion people. I feel much more comfortable that they do that in the way that Jenny describes as a descriptive bottom-up approach based on a multiplicity of technical indicators than the idea that these companies that operate globally at scale would be prescriptive about what quality is. Mark Zuckerberg said on Tuesday that he felt that Facebook had a responsibility to ensure its users use their tools for good. I'm very uncomfortable with that, I have to say. I don't think it's Mark Zuckerberg's role or Facebook's role to decide what Bild think good is, or what Süddeutsche Zeitung think good is, or The Guardian, or The Telegraph, or The Sun, or me, or Jenny, or Tanit, what good is. I think it's fine that they can empower us. I think it's fine they can try to quantify what we react well to, what we share, and what others seem to react well to. But the idea that they would impose singular indicators prescriptively on everybody, I think is not something we as society should want. I don't think it's something publishers should want, and I don't think it's something that would be good for them in the future. In terms of hiring journalists, I think more than anything, what these companies should do is collaborate, and they are beginning to understand that they are truly platforms, right? And that also involves thinking about platform governance and how you involve partners for the long term. That probably also requires hiring journalists, so that that interface between technologists, journalists, policymakers, commercial people can function on the basis of an understanding of how other people think. I think that collaboration in the future, I think we should hope that that is a multilateral collaboration instead of these bilateral and often slightly these very asymmetrical bilateral relations with giant platform X and then individual publisher Y, I think we should probably hope for some form of structured multilateral collaboration, and I think initiatives like the Credibility Coalition is an example of what that might look like.
I want to come back to defining that collaboration. Jenny, the lightning round.
So I think the major platforms have no choice but to sort of go to a flight for quality, in part because the brand advertisers, which controls, you know, tens of millions, if not hundreds of $1 million accounts, care about that. And so the big advertisers, if you sum them up, actually have, you know, it's probably 2x the spending of what the small, medium-sized SMBs. And as a result, because brand sensitivity to high-quality news is so strong, like they're already starting to feel the pressure, right? Whether or not, because P&G pulls their advertising from YouTube or Facebook. So I think, I don't even know that there is or isn't, but they're almost going to be forced to. And then the second question, which is hiring journalists, and I'm going to answer that slightly different, which is, I think, hiring former journalists. So journalists are sort of an interesting creature because generally we are mission-driven and we have a sense of right or wrong. We're generally not super money motivated, because if we were, we wouldn't have become journalists in the first place. And so there's a certain kind of personality type that is drawn into journalism, like they're, you know, whether or not they want to improve society, whether or not they think there is an inherent, generally I have a very intuitive sense of like conflict of interest that I think is not intuitive to some of my friends who like work on Wall Street. And so, that kind of personality character, I think, is a good one to bring into the conversation. But and the thing about Facebook is they brought in a lot of journalists as they did all their partnerships, but they were kind of weirdly siloed. I mean, in Facebook, it's a product culture, right? And so the partnership people don't really have, or historically haven't had very much power. They're like decorative, right? And they like kind of wear the t-shirts and they come to events like this or whatever, but that is not where the balance of power lies. And so even if you hire them, that's very different from giving them authority in the org chart, which, you know, comes with budget and headcount and sort of like, you know, being in the, to be in the room and to have a seat at the table. So that is.
Craig.
Completely in agreement with Rasmus and Jenny that they're already making quality decisions. Yes. They've been doing that since day one, and it's a question of understanding what they value and then encoding that and making that really clear and transparent, which I think is the most important thing, and it's starting to get there with the Credibility Coalition, and other groups are trying to actually define in clear ways, here are signals of value and quality in content, and they range from a whole wide spectrum of things. And if we get to the point where there are open standards around that has many, many different points, then them enforcing quality becomes something that everyone understands what they mean by that. And so I think that's the place where we need to go. The second point is, I don't think they should be hiring journalists to do reporting in journalism. I think what they should be doing is an element of what they are doing now, which is, they're funding events like this. They're funding training and workshops for journalists to train and create better journalists. They're putting money into getting a new generation of journalists to come out and helping support that. And let's be honest, the industry needs funding. Schools need funding. So I think they have a role to play in that. But they should also be helping fund these kind of open initiatives that I think can actually help stuff that does have value through, definable indicators succeed on their platform. But them actually creating that and overseeing that, I think, is a nightmare.
All right, so I want to have each of us suggest a desire of how we would work together, how we should work together, how this will operate. And I'll start the bidding myself. There's a few things that I would like to see. I think that if you go back to a Newsgeist in Helsinki 2 years ago, there was discussion of the notion of a portable content unit, that content could travel with its business model. And Richard Gingras took that back to Mountain View, and through various permutations, AMP came. And so the journalists had a real role, and a continuing role, in starting AMP as a standard. Facebook had already started instant articles, which at the time I thought, hallelujah, great, a place for news. But in time I saw that the problem, I think, was that Facebook was trying to suck up to us. Oh, you make articles, we'll make a home for it. I don't know that articles fit on Facebook. And the monetization efforts they made were entirely in the instant articles. And so there was a bet made in let's get journalism as it's done in this new platform. Contrast that with Snap. Snap said you can't do that. You have to work natively in this platform. You have to use this platform the way it's intended to be made to do journalism. So my first wish is that all the platforms, Facebook, Google, Twitter, et al., put some really smart people on thinking about the core problems. And the core problems to me are how we inform society and how we measure that, and the civility and productivity of the public conversation. And can we work together in rethinking how we do journalism at the core using these platforms natively, and can they help us monetize that natively? That's the big order I'd like to see from them. For us, I think we've heard a very nuanced disagreement so far among the 5 on the platform into what our desire is or is not for the platforms to make quality judgments. And even those who say that they fear the platforms doing that recognize that they are doing it to some extent. So I think it's incumbent upon us in journalism to help them do that, to help define what quality looks like, what does civility look like, what is productivity, and what is their Facebook made up this horrible word, informedness. What does it mean to be informed? So I'd like to see us collaborate in that way. I'd like to go to each of us to talk about what you would wish for, and then I'm going to come out and open the conversation. Jay, what's your wish for how we ought to work together?
Well, I have 2. Craig and Jenny and Ras all said that Facebook is already making quality judgments through a variety of means, but especially its algorithm. And that's where I think it should name an editor-in-chief. And the job of the editor-in-chief would not just to be, Facebook hired a journalist, but specifically to worry about the editorial judgments that are already being made by Facebook in its policies. So you need a person who's thinking about that and who has power, as Jenny said, within the organization. So that's one thing. But then in a completely other direction, I think it's likely that Facebook is just not capable of doing any of these things. That its culture is so, as Jenny pointed out, focused on metrics and comes out of an engineering mindset that it's beyond the capability of the organization to reform in the way that you suggested. And so if that's the case, what Facebook should do is provide a whole lot of money to an endowment for news, or maybe along with Google and other companies, that would represent a new kind of subsidy system for news, because the advertising subsidy is clearly gone away. And I at one time I would never have contemplated that, but the situation has grown so severe that I think something like that, a massive endowment for news, where they would give the money, it would no longer belong to Facebook, they would have no role in it, the government would have no role in it either, might be the only solution.
There was a lot of discussion in the UK about this around the BBC. What do you call the tax you call it in the UK?
License fee.
License fee, thank you, it's a tax. And the local publishers wanted their piece, and the BBC ended up hiring some journalists.
Yeah.
My one question for you is, who deserves to get a cut of that pie and who doesn't in a world of legacy companies versus bloggers in pajamas?
Sure. I mean, massive problems pop up as soon as you say something like an endowment for news. That's one of them. There's 100 more. So it would be extremely difficult to do. But I think we're at a point where something extremely dramatic and big like that has to be contemplated.
Tanit.
Well, there are certain very concrete things like being more forthcoming and sharing data with publishing houses we could then use. But you mentioned earlier the fact that my former company was playing hardball with global tech. And I'm not as gloomy as Jay in my outlook, because what we've experienced with Google is, and you mentioned Helsinki, is a rather steep learning curve, if you may call it. So if you remember the paid content discussion with Google years ago, it was still, yes, you have to, the one-click free thing, and you have to stick to that, and you need a certain type of landing page, 80 words. On that landing page, if you don't have the 80 words, then the crawler might not be nice to your subscription model. And I'm a bit astonished that Facebook, while watching all of that going on with Brussels and Berlin and et cetera, didn't realize that it might sort of hit them too eventually, and it's hitting them badly now. And Europe, which has no global tech coming from Europe, has of course no incentive to treat Facebook or Google as well friendly as they sometimes treat German car companies. So I do think, and by watching Mark Zuckerberg and listening to not just what he said in the hearings yesterday and 2 days ago, but in certain interviews, the fact that I think he and a group of high-ranking Facebook officials went to a rather large American publishing company to study what a news organization does, how it works. I think that guy who started a massive company in age 19 still has many things to learn, and I do think the hierarchy in Facebook is very much Mark driven, and for the fact that a couple of years ago he was adamant about not having paid content on Facebook, and then gradually that already changed. It's not going fast enough. I think we've been talking about paid content on Facebook for 2.5 years, 3 years now, and there are always news articles saying, oh, now it's coming, now we'll have a breakthrough, and you'll hear about it in the next weeks, and it's not happening. But the other fact, I'm not sure everybody watched the hearings yesterday and 2 days ago. What I saw, apart from a lot of very self-promotional US congressmen and senators who were talking more about themselves and their own usage of Facebook or their son's usage of Instagram, I didn't hear a lot about our business model, the business model of quality journalism. It was about misinformation, disinformation, how to treat fake news. But if we take it as a given that I think the best way to attack fake news is through very true and professionally made and good news and proper news, they should be thinking about how to let us do our job and make money from it. There's just one more aspect which I don't think we've talked enough about today so far. I've just come back from Rwanda on a tour watching mountain gorillas, which was exceptional. And when I posted the photos of mountain gorillas and golden monkeys, I got many likes, and they were shared, and I got loads of comments, and people loved that. In Rwanda last week, the Memorial Week for the Genocide also started, and we went to a large football stadium and did a march for remembrance, or walk for remembrance. And all the photos I shared about those very relevant and much more important news than the mountain gorillas, sweet as they may be, didn't get as many clicks and didn't get as many likes. So we have to come to terms, I think, with the fact that much as we consider news as valuable and hugely important for society, there are a lot of Facebook users who just don't. And of course, if Facebook realizes that 95% of content shared is not news, we can't really expect them to just roll out a red carpet for us. We need to be, as news organizations, as independent from Facebook as we can possibly be.
You two talked about collaboration. I'm going to come back to you and skip over to Craig. What's your wish list for how journalism and the platforms work together?
I think a big one is business models. Sort of your point about instant articles, I think, is really important. The skill set in newsrooms, we have not been able to innovate good new business models, and I think that that's a place where it's in everybody's interest for the platforms to actually put resources into that, of thinking about how this kind of quality content can actually succeed and how it's a good business for everybody, because that's actually, I think, the best incentive. These are for-profit companies. So there's altruism, and they're trying to buy a bit of goodwill, but at the end of the day, if it's a profitable relationship for them, that's actually going to make them invest the most in it. So I think that piece of focusing on working together on business models is important. The second piece is I would like to see them invest in helping fund these independent efforts to identify definable, clear markers of quality and have some open standards emerge there that Twitter and Facebook and Google and others adopt that are maintained independently in some ways, but also we have some accountability about how they implement them. So I think those things are really important. The other thing is actually related specifically to advertising. Facebook has had several times, and it's similar with the other platforms, where they've had to announce, yeah, we screwed up on a bunch of the metrics of how your videos performed and this kind of thing, right? And that's a huge trust-destroying issue. Jenny brought up brands, and brand safety is a big issue, but also they honestly don't believe a lot of the numbers they get from these platforms. And so just like the quality indicators piece, I'm really worried about what's happening in the ad industry, because it's rife with fraud. It's honestly a disgusting pig pile, the digital advertising ecosystem. It's crazy what is going on there, and they need to take action to help clean that up, get universal metrics and standards that go across platforms that people buy into, and actually make sure that people are buying real audiences that actually engage with things. I think that will help the business model, will help news, will help journalism, because right now, the fake stuff, the manipulated stuff, whether it's fake traffic or manipulated bot traffic, that's eating money and taking money out of the ecosystem, and people, a lot of brands are just, they don't believe the numbers that they're seeing, and they probably shouldn't in a lot of cases.
Yeah, and it's a problem for media as well. I mean, all the talk yesterday on Capitol Hill about your business model, Facebook, well, it's pretty much our business model too. Rasmus, you talked about collaboration. What does that look like?
I mean, I don't mind corporate charity. I wouldn't mind these companies giving more money to journalism, but I think what we most fundamentally need is to institutionalize what multilateral collaboration would look like. So it's clear the platforms compete against each other in what Eric Schmidt, with a deliciously indelicate phrase called the platform wars. It's clear that publishers compete with each other. It's also clear from Axel Springer and News Corp and others that of course there's a lot of friction between platforms and publishers. So what does it look like? I think we should think about, do we need something akin to the United Nations, the EU, not a political entity, but something we might think of as a news and technology union, an NTU. And of course, as anyone who looks at the UN and the EU will immediately recognize, this doesn't make conflict go away. It doesn't magically create compromise, but it creates a structure that can civilize conflict and create the foundations for building trust and reaching compromise, or just the agreement to disagree. So I don't think a structure like that would make everything magically work to the benefit of everybody, but it would create a vehicle through which we could have these conversations so that they are not always lodged in one major platform or another major platform, or by a single foundation that then loses interest 3 years later, or by a single major publishing company with special ties to the government of one country or the like. I think we need a joint enterprise for this if we want to make it work long term. And the future of every journalist in this room under 60 depends on this working out. So this is not some sort of theoretical exercise. We need this kind of structure to make it work. And it has to work not only for the current establishment, because I think this is the very real risk right now, is that the platforms will make concessions to major established publishers. The New York Times is going to be fine, the BBC is going to be fine, Springer will probably get something too. But what does that look like for, say, countries that have experienced that major platform companies have run experiments on their entire ecosystem? What does it look like if you're a small publisher far away, or a big publisher in a small market, like India, for example, that still is a relatively small market in terms of revenues? I think we need a structure for this. And as said, I'm not naive. I don't think the conflicts will go away. These conflicts are real. But the conflicts, I think, can be managed in a way where ambition can be made to counteract ambition, and we can move to a better place to realize some of those potentials that Craig and Jenny and others have talked about, where there are some places where there are win-wins, and then there are other places where we just have to say, look, our interests are not aligned, and we will have to sort of fight it out.
So you're singing in harmony with Jenny on collaboration. What's your wish list?
So we should understand, I guess, that the tech and engineering in general lives or dies on protocols and standards, like whether or not it was HTML, TCP/IP, RSS. Like, they need things that are standard in order for things to grow. So the just to give some context, I know we threw around the credibility coalition phrase a lot. It was sort of recognizing this, partially because in another life, I'm also the vice chair of the Unicode emoji subcommittee. So if you want an emoji, I'm like the person that helps you bring it to life. And from seeing that, where Google, Facebook, Adobe, Microsoft, like IBM are all kind of duking out, it's very expensive and very time intensive to create these standards. And the realization of the Credibility Coalition way back when out of MisinfoCon was that, oh, if they can't measure credibility or they have no standardized way to assess it, we're never going to move forward, right? And so it's kind of like, either they can define it or we can define it and and hopefully get their resources behind it. And so it's things like, what is the tone of the article? Does it have a lot of inbound links? Does it use anonymous sources? Does it, what's the age of the URL that it's been on? And it's in a way, a lot of people have observed that a lot of your bias or sort of your worldview is codified when you create a standard, right? And so if we're the ones, we should take charge in that and help create the standard, and at the same time understanding what it is that they need, right? So they don't want to, Google doesn't want a black box, so we're like, that's fine, it's just an open standard, like we're just giving you the boxes to tick, you can fill in the values with whatever you want. And also knowing that, okay, how many articles do you need for us to sort of like annotate for it to be useful? And they're like, at least 5,000 to 10,000 articles. And you're like, okay, like we know what will be useful for you, let us go do it. So now, but in order to do something like that, we need money. And so the only thing I would like from Facebook is, though they have committed, they have not yet done the paperwork. So my wish list is like, if the product manager, who's probably under siege right now, can actually like get the paperwork done so that they can send us the check.
Sign Jenny's papers. Sign them.
So that is my very, very concrete wish list. In contrast, Twitter, I would say, discussion to signing the paperwork was like 48 hours, like the fastest effort to money ratio I've ever experienced in my life.
All right, out here in the world, formerly known as the mass. Aaron.
So a question actually for Jay and for you, Jeff. So is part of the answer to the question that you posed back to Jay about how do you decide who gets a subsidy and who doesn't, is it what Rasmus was just talking about, where you create basically a shared service? Is something like the News Revenue Hub, for example, which is not a direct subsidy to a news organization, but actually infrastructure to support independent nonprofit news organizations, is that actually the way to solve this? And part of the reason you might want to go that way is I'm not sure a direct subsidy to a lot of these news organizations makes sense. I wouldn't want Facebook or anyone else to give another dime to a hedge fund to strip out of the organization and fill their pockets. And so, I guess that's the question. Is the answer helping the industry help itself rather than just directly subsidizing?
Jay, and I'll get as many voices as we can. Jay.
I think what I was saying is that it is more plausible to me that we would be able to work out what kind of subsidy system there should be and who should get it than it is that Facebook will transform itself to support news. So I wanted to ask if we should externalize this problem, maybe with some sort of UN type. I like that idea. It seems more plausible to me that we'll be able to work out the problems that you talked about than we will be able to change Facebook. And part of the reason I say that is the memory of incidents like the trending topics controversy, where Facebook faced criticism for allegedly engaging in political bias. And rather than have any sort of mature prudential decision-making around that charge, Facebook essentially surrendered and ran in flight from the entire conversation. That was not confidence building. Similarly, I found it astounding and disturbing when Mark Zuckerberg told the United States Congress that Facebook was a highly idealistic company. When you have a company of such massive power talking about how idealistic it is, it doesn't even occur to him that massive power and high idealism have created disasters in the 20th century and the modern world. He just doesn't seem to know that. And so those are some of the reasons why I think moving this problem out of Facebook into some other way of subsidizing and strengthening the news industry might be a better solution.
My only fear, and the discussion I had this morning around this, and I'm hearing it a little bit now, and this is not an accusation to anybody, but I worry about creeping elitism. I worry about when the internet opened up the ability for us all to speak, and some of us screwed that up, but we want to do that otherwise. Okay,
Yeah, there's something that's missing to me from this discussion. We're talking about a lot about credibility and business models, but what I'm personally very much worried about is the lack of civility and decency in public dialogue, and I think that is something that social media and the way the algorithms have encouraged a kind of aggressiveness in expression. They have very much eroded a lot of civility in public dialogue, and I think that has infiltrated journalism to an astonishing degree. And for example, I see in Germany media newsletters where media journalists write about other media. They often adopt this aggressiveness, and they take a very tabloid-like approach, deliberately misinterpreting and misstating arguments that others have stated, or they just read the headline and they don't really get into the details. So it's not really an argument, but rather shouting at each other. And this shouting, which was always promoted by Facebook and Twitter algorithms. So I think this is for me the big dangerous elephant in the room, and I think that is something where we all, for one hand, should take responsibility for our own actions, but also where I think Facebook and these companies should take actions. And why I don't have an answer to this, I think one answer, of course, is money. I think they should fund projects that take steps to promoting more civility and public dialogue, and the other thing is maybe being more transparent about the way the algorithm pushes a kind of detrimental speech, and maybe make some changes there. I don't know if that's overly idealistic, but when I get scared about this hate that is infiltrating every one of us on a daily basis.
Anyone want to respond, or more voices? I'm going to go here, but this is the third man I've called on, so let's fix that.
Well, let's have a warning.
Yes.
Okay. I'm a journalist, I'm a liberal art major, but should we perhaps forget about, for a while, about content? And since, as Jenny mentioned, engineers tend to speak about data, and perhaps one of the answers could be, instead of money, give us data, especially speaking from a publisher's point of view or a newsroom point of view, whatever data is being created by the interactions of users with content that I'm producing, which is content-specific data, I would say. So this is one thing. Then there may be another thing that is from a societal point of view. Again, data we could perhaps regulate on an antitrust basis instead of regulating the media part of it.
Rasmus, would you comment quickly on the Facebook initiative announced last week, or this week, whatever it was, to share data with researchers? Mm-hmm. What do you think about how good that program is? And following up with the question, could you imagine a similar initiative for data to publishers?
Well, okay, so first, just the initiative that was launched is the idea that there would be created an independent vehicle that would be supported economically by a range of foundations and run by a committee of researchers who would approve research projects that would be given privacy-compliant data sets from Facebook systems on behavior on the platform, but could combine that with other methods for research purposes. The origin of that idea is the idea of a multi-stakeholder collaboration to enable research, not unlike what I described for enabling journalism, originally articulated by Gary King and Nate Pursley from Stanford. Now, I think that model is very powerful for research. I don't think it's as powerful for publishing, because publishers will want real-time data that's forward-looking, whereas researchers can use historical data and more anonymized data. I would say on the arguments about data sharing, I mean, it's very clear what publishers basically want from platforms, right? More editorial control, how is our content displayed, more brand recognition, more data, and enabling a variety of different forms of monetization. Now, all of those things are not necessarily well aligned with my interest as a user. So Craig and his publisher may want my data, but do I want Facebook to share my data with Craig? Right. Not so much. I think you should ask Aaron or others about the kind of data that publishers have been acquiring. I think the term of use currently is harvesting from Facebook. If you look at the things that some publishers have been asking for there, it is not so different from what political campaigns and political consultants have been acquiring, because that stuff is powerful. But do I want it as a user to be shared with third parties without my consent? And if it has to be based on consent, then these platforms would have to name every single organization they would share my data with. So I understand this intent, and I trust that your organization, as BuzzFeed, would probably use this in an ethical way, But as a user, I'm a bit uncomfortable with this idea that the platforms have some sort of hard obligation to share my information with every publisher in the world if that publisher came begging for it.
And by the way, publishers are lobbying for that very hard.
Oh, yes,
absolutely. They are all over the platforms for that. And
Yeah.
right now, with the Cambridge Analytica scandal, what's happening is there's a moment for privacy, which is really overdue. But as somebody who uses Facebook and data a lot for reporting, they've turned off and reduced APIs that we have used for reporting. We wanted to update a big investigation we did last year. We're screwed. We can't do it. They've taken the data away. Ways of finding people, they've removed features for that as well. So what's happening right now is they're locking down the platforms more. Good motivation, privacy for users, but it's starting to screw us a bit in actually reporting and holding the platforms accountable as well. So we have a bad dynamic that's starting to come out, and these things need to be negotiated and figured out.
And further, I will argue at every possible opportunity that what we see the internet do is kill the mass media business model, with it the mass media institution, with it the idea of the mass, and that we in media have to deliver greater relevance and value to people. The only way to do that is to know you as an individual or member of a community. The only way to do that is to have information about you. But we're seeing, I think, the potential of going, privacy is extremely important and it's being protected by GDPR, but I think it could have unintended consequences on our future business models. And we've got to figure that out. Other ideas, questions, challenges?
I don't think we talked a lot about the role of transparency, especially in algorithms and disclosing that, and I'm wondering if you guys could talk about your perspectives on that as well as we're talking about the privacy issue and sharing data, what role transparency and whether that would be helpful as well.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and I think everybody here would love to know why we're seeing what we're seeing in our news feed. I'd also like to know the Coca-Cola recipe. I'm afraid they won't share it, probably. I think, given that social media is about, I don't know, 5 minutes old in the longer perspective, I think we're all experimenting a lot, we're learning a lot. I'm hopeful they may learn more too. And yes, I would like to know how the algorithm works, given it's sort of the biggest company secret they have. I'm not wholly optimistic that we will ever get full transparency. What would be nice from a news perspective would be not to be suddenly confronted with the traffic dropping as it did in autumn last year, without being notified beforehand because somebody fiddled with the algorithm. And then you make calls to other editorial teams, to other competitors saying, do you see the same thing in your traffic? Yes, we do. And then confront Facebook with it. And then first they say, actually, we didn't. And then at some point they say, yeah, we did. So when it comes to that, yes, I'd love more transparency.
Rasmus.
The news industry would be in a better position to demand transparency from a platform like Facebook if it were more transparent itself.
True.
I would like to know, for example, what the decision rules are for why The Guardian or The New York Times or The Washington Post picks stories that it picks. I'd love to know about the editorial priorities of news organizations and be able to find what those are and maybe even argue with news organizations about them. So I think that journalism has a long way to go for it to be the model of transparency that it wants the platforms to be.
Rasmus?
On transparency, I think Jay has written very insightfully about how some forms of transparency can be very good and very powerful things. I think we all need to keep in mind that transparency can also be dangerous. There are long traditions of political science research showing how transparency measures in the US Congress, for example, have empowered lobbyists and special interests far more than ordinary citizens. And if there's greater transparency around how ranking algorithms work, on what basis do we simply assume that quality information providers would be better at utilizing that transparency to promote their content than all sorts of malicious and bad actors out there who are also trying to promote their content? So I personally, I'm a little bit wary of this term transparency, though I think it's a very important discussion, and I'm personally quite interested in the idea that an American legal scholar called Frank Pascal, who is, by the way, is a big critic of the platform companies, offers, and he talks about what he calls an intelligible society, so not one in which technical details or data is shared, but a world in which institutions have a responsibility to help us understand not the exact what, but the why and the so what, if you will. So I think we as users, and often also publishers, need to understand what is the intent behind a change to an algorithm. Why is it happening? When is it happening? What are the probable outcomes of it? That, I think, would often be much more useful for a publisher than technical details. It would certainly be much more useful for me as a citizen.
And I also think, Rasmus, the principles behind it.
Yeah.
That what we really are asking for is what the goals are and the principles.
I'm always afraid I mispronounce his name, but Jaron Lanier has talked about the idea of reimbursing users for their data. And I'm wondering if everybody needs that, is there something to that, maybe even if it were randomized the way traditional poll researchers do? If the platforms were reimbursing people for their data?
Anyone? I think one idea that's mentioned too, though, is besides this notion of paying for it per se and this notion that you own the data, exchanges where we have some measure of recognizing that value are other opportunities. We're running on time, so we'll get more voices.
I had a question for Jenny. I wanted to come back to over here, sorry. I was struck by what you were mentioning, sort of the culture in Silicon Valley and how relentlessly driven it is by metrics and outcome and how kind of at odds or maybe even irreconcilable that is with the sort of social goods that we're talking about, like democracy and journalism. So how do we resolve that, though? How do we, collaboration seems to be one solution, but can we really leave it up to the platforms and to that culture, that big tech Silicon Valley culture, to suddenly decide, well, actually, let's have a cultural revolution, and let's do something then that we're not very good at and that won't earn us very much money? I mean, what is the solution to get them to change the culture?
I mean, on a very macro level, it's probably requiring more of a liberal arts education for computer science majors, but that's probably a 10 to 15 year kind of arc. But I mean, it is one, so there are a couple things. As I mentioned before, the DNA of companies tend to reflect the DNA of their founders and also of the founding teams. So to a certain extent, it is forcing the things in Silicon Valley and what they care about to care about more than making money and care more about big numbers with lots of zeros. I think it is also exposing leadership before it becomes leadership into a lot of these qualitative kind of debates and decisions. So, not just catching them at the sort of, undergraduate level or whatnot, but further up the chain. It's sort of the same way that the business schools briefly try to work on ethics after the 2008 collapse. Like, maybe just making money for the sake of making money isn't all you guys should be trying to do. And I don't know how successful it was, but at least Harvard Business School at all tried to do that. So I think there is it's about shaping characters in that culture en masse, right? But I don't necessarily know what the mechanisms of that are most effective. And I mean, making them read a lot more books also. It's like kind of all over the place. But it's just interesting because when you have these conversations with people, they often, I think the best examples, they don't necessarily like, oh, was the movie good? Well, I don't know if the movie was good, but I liked it. And I'm like, in our world, the mere fact that you liked it is what makes it good, right? But unless it has a high score on Rotten Tomatoes or it did well on IMDb, they objectively, some of them cannot tell if a movie was good, right? So there's something like weird about that, and how you change it or how you flip it. I mean, the first step is just recognizing it, right? I think it was, it was just for me kind of sitting, like, how do you guys not know if a movie is good, even though you liked it? So anyway, that did not completely answer your question, other than sort of like whole-scale like re-education of people who are slightly Asperger's-y, but that's my answer at this point. Yeah.
We have one more back here, then we'll come up and wrap up.
Yeah, Ezra Eamon, EBU. A quick question. Facebook is currently having workshops around defining quality news indicators with the industry. Do we think this is a good thing to, or is it a slippery slope? Like, who's defining then quality news indicators, and should we do this together with Facebook?
What do you think? Is that me? Who is that? I just
I think there is a danger that it's an elitist exercise, but I'm putting the question open to the table, because who's invited to this discussion? Is it a few selected few people who can decide what then becomes quality news? And
anyone?
I mean, I just feel like I just answered a question. Yeah. So I mean, I can answer it. So, I mean, this is something that we work on literally like day by day every week. So there are a couple things. One, the Credibility Coalition is an open coalition, so basically anyone can join. It's very much bottom up. And the key thing of what we decided to do is that we're not necessarily filling in the values or saying like this is important or this is not important, or how to weigh them in the same, in the way that Google uses its ranking algorithm in different ways. Like we're just like, these are the kinds of things that you should care about. It could be a grand list of 300, 500 items, and we'll tell you like, if you're going to fill it in, what it should look like. What does a date look like? Should it include, the timestamp? Like, what is a way to measure how aggressive advertisements are on a page, right? So just coming up with like how you define the data, and I think that is a very good first step. And then the next thing is how that data is filled in is not necessarily, can be company by company, right? And the idea is that there is not a universal standard that like, you guys go make your black box, like go fill it, like, have at it. But at the same time, at least we'll give you a training set, at least we'll give you sort of samples of what it could look at. Right, and there's always unintended consequences, and there's always sort of like things that happen as a result. But at the very least, we're trying to meet the platforms halfway, right? Which is like, we know you speak standards and we know you speak data, so like we will try to speak standards and data in a way that can help solve the problem that you're trying to solve, and in a way by it's just like anyone can join. It's like academics, it's journalists, it's like whoever shows up on the Google Hangout, on Thursdays, and like in many standards organizations, like people who do the work get to have share of voice. Like you don't necessarily have to, just in one example, like I don't work for a major platform. I showed up at an Unicode meeting very indignant. There was no dumpling emoji, and just like by doing the work, I managed to like kind of push through like dozens and dozens of emoji, including like hijab. Like standards organizations tend to reflect like people who are passionate and competent. So hopefully, that is something that will also be reflected in this kind of standards organization.
Yeah, and I think that I, for one, oppose the idea of a blacklist or a whitelist, or in some other nomenclatures, red, green, or yellow lists. Every platform, every advertiser, ultimately every user makes decisions on their own, but can we give them more data to help make those decisions? And can we do it in a more standardized way that is thus more transparent? So these are signals of quality, not necessarily final judgments of quality, which I think is important. All right, we have like 3 minutes left. Any Facebook executives watching this, what's your last message to them?
Well, I think the world is accustomed to either governments by force or governments by consent. And with Facebook, we're facing this third category of uninformed consent, because that's, as users, what we give this platform. We don't really understand what it's doing to us. We don't really understand what's happening to our data. We do sign this document that says terms of service that says, yeah, you can, and I think the future of uninformed consent is the future of Facebook, because it's entirely built on that notion. And now the problems with that are coming home to them in a big way, with regulation in Europe, with the hearings in Congress. And I believe that the people in that company still think they can get away with uninformed consent, and I'm not sure they can.
Anyone else? Anyone else? Ross.
I mean, I think it's clear there were a number of years in which a lot of people argued that the platform companies made a lot of money off of other people's news. I think now we're living in a time where it's very clear that the platform companies are getting an awful lot of grief because they host and distribute news. And I would just say this: however tempting it may be for the platforms to just walk away and minimize their engagement with news, please don't. It would be a catastrophe for journalism, and it would be a catastrophe for our societies if these companies do not take seriously that they have to continue to provide an open and diverse infrastructure for free expression.
Anyone else, Tanit?
The CEO of Google, Sundar Pichai, reads the Wall Street Journal, I think, in print every morning, or at least has a subscription. And I do have a feeling, after meeting him, that he does genuinely care about news. And I would love to have the same feeling about Facebook. And I still haven't given up hope that they will care about news a lot more than they do now.
Any other?
Invest more resources in emerging democracies, because that's where some of the worst misinformation is spreading, and it's actually killing people, literally. That's one of the things they need to get on right now.
I mean, mine is very simple. If I'm talking to Facebook, which is, can we get the paperwork so that we can get the purchase orders? I mean, like,
sign the paper.
Right? Just, you send us the paperwork, okay?
Matthew Ingram, sitting here, pointed out to me earlier today that this magnificent, imposing venue was completed more than 100 years before the invention of movable type. To your point earlier, Tanit, we are in the infancy of this wonderful new thing we have. It isn't all fucked up and ruined, and we shouldn't act like that because we're still inventing it. So I thank you all for braving the rain. I thank you all for coming out. Sorry I'm not Campbell, but I hope you consider that we had a good and productive discussion. Thank you. Great rest of the festival.